and it's a risk. It's good. It works good. Your personal brand can work really well for coaching, for digital courses, things like that. But because there's a scale issue, but that's where it ties in, is in the motion when they meet with you, the comfort level to buy from you. If you have a good personal brand and a system in place, you're probably in an okay spot, depending on what you're selling, even to a bigger company. But if you're all about you and you're gonna have to be involved the whole time, bigger companies pull back from that because that's a risk to pay you money. I don't think a lot of people realize that. They say, we have a company, I'm an organization, I lead it, I'll make sure we have the right resources in place, like whatever that means to them. That gives the corporate buyer comfort that it's not just you.
Your business's success depends on relationships with customers, relationships with employees, and relationships with stakeholders. What do they all have in common? They're all human. Because no matter if a business is B2B or B2C, it's really H to H, human to human. Welcome to the Human Connection Podcast. I'm your host, Carl Ponto. Each week I'll bring you stories, insights, and practical advice that you can apply to your growing company and daily life. This week I'm excited to connect with Thomas Helfrich. Thomas is a growth strategist, entrepreneur, and host of the top 5% global podcast, Cut the Tie, with over 1 million YouTube subscribers and a combined social reach in the millions, including over 36,000 followers on LinkedIn. Getting a little ahead of myself there. He's built a 7-figure marketing agency, advises high-growth startups, and helps entrepreneurs cut the ties holding them back, from excuses to outdated strategies. Known for his bold voice, sharp humor, and practical insights, Thomas brings real talk, real strategies, and real results to every conversation. Congrats on Cut the Tie, and welcome to the Human Connection Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Carl. How are you?
Doing all right. So I love something you mentioned when we were kind of prepping for this, is that lead gen is never the problem. So why is lead gen never the problem?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. It's nice to have the opportunity to be here today. Lead gen is often what people would say, I have a problem with lead gen. It's actually a symptom, typically, of a broken system in place. So we can dive into that. But what people think of lead gen is probably actually not lead gen. It's a tactic you're doing as part of a system.
And so what is the underlying cause of that symptom that they are kind of misdiagnosing or focusing on?
Well, I think it comes down to understanding that, when let's use LinkedIn, for example. If you're doing outreach in LinkedIn, you're like, hey, my lead generation's not working. I'm sending DMs, it's not working. That's a tactic as part of a bigger strategy of a lead generation system. And so what I've seen and what I've found over, doing this for billion-dollar companies down to solopreneurs is that it's, there's a lot of things that have to happen before and after that DM or your outreach or your ad. And that has to do with the problem you solve and articulating that in a very, good way. And the customers that, how many do you need and who should you interact with and how do they want to be interacted with? There's a lot of things that need to happen before that and after that to make lead generation, the act of reaching out to somebody, work.
And so what are some of these other things that companies aren't doing right that makes them think that their quote unquote lead generation is the problem?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, we think there's about 9 areas I found that there's usually some crack in a foundation you need to have. And the first piece always is the problem you solve. Now, if you're a solopreneur, you typically solve one problem for a very refined group, and you got to make sure that it's a critical problem. So what I mean by that is, you don't want to say something like, we create, happier workforces so they're productive. That's not a critical problem. What you would say is we actually help you get the return on investment for the investment you've made in a workforce by making it more effective. And that's a critical problem because people who buy that kind of service, let's say, don't buy productivity. They want investment returns for the people they've hired. And so you have to frame it in a way. So first and foremost is just articulating a problem in a critical way. Probably the second thing is then who's going to buy that? And how many of those do you need? So a lot of people overreach. They tend to have too wide an audience. And I'll give you an example. A friend of mine who does SEO writing, I said, who's your ideal customer? And he said, solopreneurs. And I'm like, well, that's about 300 million people globally. And I was like, well, how many do you need a month to kind of, be good, right? And he's like, oh, like 4 ongoing. And I'm like, then why are you targeting, 300 million? Why aren't you targeting like 100 people that really need this service to just close 4 of them? And it kind of shook his mind. I'm like, so you don't have to like be that to everybody. And so high level. So I think just knowing how many customers you need, who really can help with it, helps piece that together. And then that starts driving into the strategy and some other pieces with that. But those two first steps, I'd say, are the biggest problem. They're not articulating the problem well enough, and they don't really have a good command on who's going to buy it and how narrow that audience needs to be. If you're a bigger company, it's a slightly different game, but most solopreneurs, small businesses are in that zone.
Yeah, I think that the overall kind of seems like a subset of the mistake that people make, thinking they need to they want to have as wide a net as possible. When in reality, if you stretch your net that big, you're going to create a bunch of holes that all the fish are going to swim through. You're not going to catch anyone because your messaging is so generic or vague. It doesn't move people in a way that actually inspires them to take action. It just kind of is this blasé, watered down messaging. And so I think
in your analogy, right? So also to catch smaller fish, it takes a certain type of net. If you're trying to catch whales, you don't use a net. And so there's it's illegal. I think you harpoon them. I'm not really sure the techniques. I think it's actually illegal at this point. But the point being is that there's different tools for the different thing you're trying to catch. And you wouldn't catch, a blue marlin if that was your whale. It's probably more appropriate. You'd use a specific type of lure and you'd get them to your boat. You don't get them very often, but when you get them, it's a big one. If you want to get a bunch of little fish, you throw the net out and you hope to get a bunch in there. Some get a couple crabs and other things you don't want. That's the whole point, is that you got to understand who and how many to that problem. And you're absolutely right. People get too generic and they throw too much in the wall. And if you're an entrepreneur with a touch of the ADD, you see all the opportunities, but don't realize you're losing so many by not focusing on just the one.
Yeah, and there's that FOMO that people think it makes it worth just going after everything. But when you get that scattered, you end up not closing any of the opportunities that you kind of half-assed because it doesn't resonate enough, and you're not following through enough because you switch to the next group before you even finish closing the first one. So it's so when you're working with larger companies on this, because solopreneurs is it makes sense that one person needs to kind of focus on one thing. With bigger companies, it seems like they might be harder to convince to go after or kind of narrow their approach as much, because they think, we have a big enough team, we have all these offers. It seems like though there's still a similar problem for a lot of these brands, that they're offering too many things or trying to do too many things at once. Like the classic example was Apple. When they brought Steve Jobs back, he went and cut back 600 of their different product offerings down to 4, because they're just so scattered and no one could tell what the heck they were doing or what they were buying. And so that's can be somewhat an extreme case, but I think there's still a lot of businesses that are trying to overreach these days, and they're trying to do too much dilutes their messaging, and they're not really able to connect with the right people on the right level. Or do you see that problem scaling up in the same way from solopreneurs to larger companies?
Yes, and yes and no. I'll say why. I mean, that is, you gave a great example, but if you look like SAP, which they do kind of ERP systems and things like that, they solve one major problem for all different kinds of industries. So they just become industry focused on how they apply that. They are the technology to get your ERP or correct. Nike, as much stuff as they have, they still have an overarching problem they solve. Just let's do it. Let's get out there and do it. And what does that mean? Well, based on their size and their company and other things, they have shoes, they have clothes, they have everything you need to go fulfill that promise of let's do it. Just do it. I'm sorry. So when you think about that giant company, they still are around a critical problem of getting out there and getting stuff done, or I need to get my ERP stuff so I can be as effective as possible. It's an example of Apple that you gave, which is excellent. That's exactly right. They sell 4 things effectively. And I'd even argue none of those are actually what their value is, which is the data behind it. They're a data collection company now at this point. So that it still applies. One of our $1 billion client, they rebuild cities, right? That's their use case, and their problem was they just wanted to be. I don't want to have to explain who I am when I go to RFP. And we accomplish that by just being the brand that rebuilds cities in a great way, 4.0, next version, whatever. The point is you just get around a central problem, and then and this leads to content and how you kind of position stuff with you. But there's like maybe 8 to 12 subtopics you can talk about. And based on your company or your focus, you can really lock it in. And it becomes very clear, specifically when you're a solopreneur or small business owner, where that success is, and everything else you should just push away. Pet projects, you should some room for innovation, I'll call it. But at the end of the day, you got to make money, and you get rid of the stuff that doesn't work or isn't working well.
And I think when you mentioned like having that brand recognition for the companies that are going after RFPs and don't have to explain themselves, I think that that focus on brand building and having an established kind of relationship with the clients you're already doing business with or want to be doing business with is something that a lot of companies are lacking these days because they haven't really spent time building those brand relationships with decision makers. They focus so much on like what they do or like their like kind of the tech, but not on the communication or the really differentiating themselves in a meaningful way. And I think that's something that, especially at the B2B level, is essential because there's so many options out there that when you're trying to go up against and you're trying to get the attention of decision makers at a C-suite level who have 1,000 other things on their mind, and none of them are necessarily like wanting to go dive deep on who you are unless you make it really, really simple for them. That kind of the marketing and the outreach to build those relationships is something I don't think enough companies do or do very well. And it really reflects in how much they struggle with lead gen because no one really knows who they are when they do that outreach, and they become another like voice in the noise.
So on brand specifically, right? So if we have a framework we follow, which is start with the problem, really get to know the customer, develop a strategy around where and who and how and why, then your brand needs to bleed that promise. And I think another piece I see a lot of people fail on in a lead generation system is they make the brand about them, which it does make a little sense when you're on your own, you're first starting. But the more you make it about you as a person, and that's why with the bigger companies, they do this well because they're a business and they don't, anybody can kind of get hit by a bus and it continues. On smaller brands specifically, when it's about the founder or a very small around people, they're not selling the brand around a promise to solve that critical problem. And when you do that, you put yourself not only in a better place to be perceived as more legitimate and more able to solve it, you also put yourself in a spot where you can actually eventually sell your business or exit from it because it's not built around you. You are just an additive bonus, as will be the next person you might hire to help solve that problem. And so I see a lot of people struggle with that too from a scale standpoint. And one, their brand doesn't bleed the promise to solve it. And two, it's too much around their person.
Yeah, I think there's this, the brand definitely needs to be about the problem you're solving or the people you're trying to help, because that's what your audience actually cares about. They don't necessarily care about all your backstory and necessarily who you are as much. I think the who, like the people are kind of comes into play when it comes to describing how you solve that problem or what, why this problem is so like why you're a good fit for the people you're trying to connect with, and it helps you build that rapport. Or it's not necessarily, it's kind of humanizes the connection between the people you're trying to help and the problem you're trying to solve. But it can't be the sole thing of the brand is the founder, because if the founder wants to leave or the founder gets sick or there's some like problem and that person leaves, and then you have this huge void in the brand and the identity of the company that's so tied to one person. It's like you don't want to have, it's like not having any like processes or systems in place for your like bookkeeping, and your bookkeeper leaves or retires and you're like, how do we do this now? So the same thing with a brand, you don't want to have it be reliant on one person, but having the like what makes you different is inspired by some of the founder, or inspired by the human side of things, makes it more relatable. But yeah, I agree. You don't want it to be our brand is the one person, because that obviously it doesn't scale, or it's very eggs in one basket sort of thing. And it's interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so where that relates specifically around lead gen, right, is I like your brand, like they like the person, let's say, and then they get into the meeting, they take the call because they like your vibe or whatever. But then you don't have a system, or if they're too big of a company, they don't feel like you have enough team to support them, and it's a risk. It's good. It works good. Your personal brand can work really well for coaching, for digital courses, things like that. But there's a scale issue. But that's where it ties in, is in the motion when they meet with you, the comfort level to buy from you. If you have a good personal brand and a system in place, you're probably in an okay spot, depending on what you're selling, even to a bigger company. But if you're all about you and you're gonna have to be involved the whole time, bigger companies pull back from that because that's a risk to pay you money. I don't think a lot of people realize that. They say, we have a company, I'm an organization, I lead it, I'll make sure we have the right resources in place, like whatever that means to them. That gives the corporate buyer comfort that it's not just you. We're not gonna be waiting for you. We're not gonna get, more importantly, the person hiring you is not saying, I'm gonna get fired for hiring the wrong person. So that's motivation. So anyway, that's how it ties into lead gen specifically.
Yeah, I think it's something, it's a important understanding for people to keep in mind when they're reaching out to any client or any sort of lead, is that understanding how they're being perceived by that audience, and really understanding and empathizing with where they're coming from, and what their values are, or what they're bringing to what they're considering when they're thinking about whether they're going to hire you. Because it's not just about, like you said, the offer. It's also about the weighing the risks of bringing you on versus a team, I think. And so people just don't necessarily, especially solopreneurs who maybe haven't had that sort of experience or haven't been on the other side of the table, might not be aware of what those sort of considerations or concerns that end up killing a potential deal because they're just too small. And so I think it comes down to, again, just understanding your audience and making sure you're framing and crafting a message that shows you understand what they actually care about and can de-risk your offer to them. Because if you just go in there talking about all the things that you find exciting about what you're doing, you're going to talk right past them, because you're just might as well be blaring a bullhorn saying, I don't understand my audience, Exactly.
No, it's and once you've established your brand, right, you're describing some of the parts around content and engagement of how you interact with people. And that could be use cases, that could be your posts, that could be YouTube channel, podcasts like this, whatever it is. But if you go back to the original problem, right, and you solve too many things or you're too broad, when you go into a podcast, your authority on the subject becomes very weak and thin as well. Or when people listen, you're all over the place. And they're like, I'm not really sure what that person does. Interesting, though, interesting, but not relevant. And so if we've learned this lesson the hard way. We used to, we started off right where we were now as a LinkedIn lead generation company, and got way too big as a digital agency for a couple of years. And I'm like, this is terrible. It's horrible. It's hard to manage. And we went back to more of, once again, the lead generation with a tip of spear, typically LinkedIn, but more on the value, which was strategy. And then once we lined up our brand, or our company brand, my brand, all the things that are used in the lead generation process, and the content became very easy. So a lot of people overthink content. And the reason they do is because they have too many problems they're trying to solve, or they haven't really nailed it down and for the right customer. But once you nail it, it's pretty easy. I'll give this advice, and this is really probably more to, I think it applies to B2C, but I'm less familiar with that space. We're definitely B2B in the services space. From this perspective, if you just post, let's say even 2 times a week, and you have an overarching, that main product critical problem you're solving, a quick AI chat GPT interaction that says, here's the main problem I solve and who I solve it for. Give me 8-12 sub topics, SEO searched on YouTube. It'll do a really good thing to 8 to 12 questions people are asking around that topic. It's really good at that. Those can just become the content, literally headlines for your content. And all you need to do is repeat it every month with slightly different variations. You're not going to be a Joe Rogan. You're not going to be a Mr. Beast or some kind of entertainment channel. You're a business. So you got to catch people when they're in that season that need you. So you need to repeat yourself a little bit without copying and pasting. So if you can just do that, you can track it and stuff and see how the views do and engagements and meetings, and you're smart about your analytics a little bit. It's really not that hard, because one problem, some subtopics, and then have fun making that content. You knock it out in a day.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for connecting with me today, Thomas. If you enjoyed this episode of the Human Connection podcast, please like, leave a review, and share it. If you'd like to connect with myself or Thomas, check out the links in the show notes. And remember, no matter if your business is B2B or B2C, it's really H to H, human to human. Happy connecting.